All right, everyone, get ready for today. We're taking a deep dive into a topic that's super relevant in today's world, humanitarian intervention.
Definitely relevant. And if you're prepping for the UPSC exam, especially the International Relations paper, well, this one's right up your alley.
For sure. We're going to be talking about some complex stuff, the kind of stuff that really makes you think. We're talking about the clash between a nation's right to run its own affairs,
Yeah, their sovereignty.
right, sovereignty, and the need to protect people when their own governments aren't doing that, when things get really bad.
Exactly. It's this constant balancing act on the global stage. I mean, on the one hand, you've got international law, and traditionally it places a lot of emphasis on this idea of respecting borders.
The inviolability of borders, right? Like
And
each country gets to decide what goes on within its own territory.
right, no
Yeah.
interference, but then what happens when really terrible human rights abuses are happening inside those borders? That's when things get ethically tricky.
Yeah, that's where the whole concept of humanitarian intervention comes in.
Exactly.
And it's a tough one, right? It's like, do we stick to the principle of non-interference, even if it means standing by while horrible things are happening?
That's a tough question.
Or do we say, look, there are some situations that are so bad, so morally wrong, that we have to step in, even if it means crossing those borders?
You've got it. It's a dilemma with huge implications. And to really understand the debate, you have to analyze both sides of the coin.
Okay, so let's flip that coin then. What are the arguments for respecting absolute state sovereignty, even when things are going wrong within a country?
Well, one argument is that upholding state sovereignty leads to more stability and predictability in international relations.
Okay, I see. So if everyone knows that other countries won't interfere in their internal affairs no matter what.
It could reduce the risk of conflict, yeah. Countries know where they stand, there's less uncertainty.
Makes sense. But then there's the other side of the coin. What if respecting sovereignty means turning a blind eye to atrocities?
That's the huge moral cost. If absolute non-interference is the rule, then there's no mechanism to stop genocide, mass killings, or other horrific human rights violations.
It's a real ethical tightrope walk, isn't it? And
Yeah.
for our UPSC folks out there, being able to articulate these arguments clearly and concisely, that's got to be key for the exam.
Absolutely. Now, one framework that helps us try to navigate these murky waters is just war theory.
Okay, just war theory. I've heard of that. Isn't that about, like, when it's morally okay to go to war?
It is. It's been around for centuries, and traditionally it focuses on self-defense. Like, when can a state justifiably use force to protect itself? But humanitarian intervention throws a wrench into that.
Because you're not defending yourself in those cases. You're stepping in to defend other people in another country.
Precisely. And that's a fundamental shift. It takes us from a more nationalistic, ethical viewpoint to a more cosmopolitan one, a global perspective.
And that raises a whole new set of questions. Like, do we have a moral obligation to protect people beyond our borders, even if it means putting our own soldiers at risk?
Exactly. Those are the tough questions humanitarian intervention forces us to confront.
Heavy stuff. Really makes you think.
It does. And speaking of tough questions, one of the big ones is, well, what are the specific grounds for humanitarian intervention?
Okay, so what are the triggers? When is it considered justified to actually intervene?
Well, one major justification you'll hear a lot about is human rights. The idea that all individuals, regardless of where they live or their background, have certain fundamental rights that must be protected.
Yeah, human rights. I mean, those are kind of like a cornerstone of modern international law, aren't they?
They are. Think about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, for instance. It lays out 30 articles outlining a whole range of rights, and you could argue that a violation of any one of these rights, well, technically it could be grounds for intervention.
Wait, so you're saying if a country isn't fully upholding even one of those rights, other countries could potentially have a justification to intervene?
It's a possibility, at least in theory. And that's one of the critiques of using human rights as the sole justification for intervention.
It's too broad a category.
Yeah, it is. Plus, you have to consider that different cultures and religions, they might interpret these rights in different ways.
Right. What's considered a human rights violation in one place might not be seen the same way somewhere else. So just saying we're intervening to protect human rights can be a bit, I don't know, slippery.
It can be.
Right.
Applying a universal standard across such diverse societies, it's definitely challenging.
Okay, so maybe human rights are too broad a justification. Is there something more specific, a more clear-cut scenario that tends to trigger calls for humanitarian intervention?
There is. And it's sadly something we've seen too many times in recent history.
Yeah.
Genocide.
Yeah, genocide. The systematic attempt to wipe out an entire group of people. That's pretty universally condemned as a crime against humanity.
It is. And for many, it's seen as the most compelling justification for intervention, for stepping in to stop the killing.
Makes sense. Hard to argue with that. But even with something as horrific as genocide, I imagine there are still challenges in using it as the sole trigger for intervention.
You're right. Not all large-scale killings are genocide, right? Some are the result of state failure or widespread violence that isn't specifically targeted at wiping out a particular group.
So you might have a situation with mass casualties, but it's not necessarily intentional or pre-planned genocide.
Exactly. And distinguishing between those situations can be very difficult. So we need a more nuanced framework than just genocide or not genocide to guide these decisions.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What's the framework that helps us make sense of these really complex situations?
That brings us to a really important development in international law, the concept of the responsibility to protect, often shortened to R2P.
R2P. Okay, I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means.
Well, it emerged from a report back in 2001 by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. Basically, it was an attempt to create clearer guidelines for when military intervention might be justified to protect civilians from mass atrocities.
So is it just a fancier way of saying humanitarian intervention? Or is there something more to it?
There's definitely more to it. R2P is trying to shift the focus from a state's right to sovereignty to its responsibility to protect its people. It's saying, look, even if a state isn't actively committing genocide, if it's failing to protect its citizens from mass suffering, then the international community might have a responsibility to step in.
I see. So it broadens the scope beyond just genocide.
It does. R2P outlines two key criteria that could justify intervention. First, there has to be a large-scale loss of life.
Okay, and that could be due to a lot of things. Deliberate government actions, neglect, even a failed state situation where the government has basically collapsed.
Exactly. And the second criterion is large-scale ethnic cleansing, which could involve things like killings, forced expulsions, even widespread rape used as a weapon of war. So R2P widens the net, so to speak, to encompass a broader range of humanitarian catastrophes.
Okay, so it sounds like R2P is an attempt to find a middle ground, to recognize that humanitarian crises are complicated,
Yep.
but also to provide some clearer guidelines for action than just focusing solely on genocide.
That's a good way to put it. It's an attempt to balance competing values and provide a framework for making these very difficult decisions.
But even with a framework like R2P, I imagine there are still some major challenges, like who gets to decide when intervention is actually justified?
Oh, that's a huge question.
Right? We're talking about countries sending troops into another sovereign nation. That's a big deal.
It is a big deal. It can't be a unilateral decision. There needs to be some kind of international consensus. And the most obvious place to look for that is the UN Security Council.
Right, the Security Council. They're the ones tasked with maintaining international peace and security, so it makes sense that they would have a role to play in authorizing interventions.
You'd think so, but the Security Council, well, it has its own issues.
Yeah, let's be real, the UN is far from perfect.
Yeah.
What are some of the issues that get in the way?
Well, a big one is the veto power held by the 5 permanent members. You know, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. If any one of them objects to an intervention, it's basically a no-go, no matter how dire the situation on the ground is.
And those vetoes, they're not always based on purely humanitarian concerns, are they?
Let's just say geopolitics plays a role, a big role. So you can have a situation where a humanitarian crisis is unfolding, everyone agrees something needs to be done, but one of the permanent members blocks action because it doesn't align with their strategic interest.
Okay, so that's a major roadblock. What happens then? Does the world just stand by and watch as
No.
people suffer?
It shouldn't. And that's one of the things that the R2P framework tries to address. It acknowledges that if the Security Council is paralyzed, if it fails to act, there need to be other ways to authorize intervention.
Okay, so what are the backup options?
Well, one possibility is to take the issue to the UN General Assembly for a vote. They don't have the same veto power as the Security Council.
Right, so it's more of a democratic process.
Mhm.
But does a vote in the General Assembly carry the same weight as a Security Council resolution?
That's debatable. Some argue that bypassing the Security Council weakens the UN system and could set a dangerous precedent. Others say that if the Security Council is failing to uphold its responsibility to protect civilians, then other actors need to step in.
Okay, so it's not a perfect solution. Are there any other pathways for authorizing intervention if the Security Council is a no-go?
There are. Regional organizations like NATO or the African Union could potentially authorize interventions within their respective regions.
Okay, so there are backup plans if the primary mechanism for authorization stalls. It's good to know there are options, even if they're not without their own controversies.
Exactly. There are always going to be different perspectives on the legitimacy of different approaches. And that's part of what makes this whole debate so complex.
Yeah, this has been a whirlwind of information already. We've covered a lot of ground: sovereignty versus intervention, ethical frameworks, the challenges of getting authorization for interventions.
And we're not done yet. Remember how we talked about how loaded the term humanitarian intervention itself is? It's time to dig into that a bit.
Yeah, you mentioned the language we use when talking about this topic can be really important.
It is. It shapes our understanding of what's going on and can even be used to justify actions that might be, well, less than humanitarian.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What's so problematic about the term humanitarian intervention? What's lurking beneath the surface?
Well, let's start with humanitarian. On the face of it, it implies this deep concern for human welfare, a pure desire to alleviate suffering. But critics argue that labeling something as humanitarian can create this aura of moral righteousness that might mask other motivations.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So are you saying countries could be using the humanitarian label to cover up other agendas? Like maybe they're actually intervening for strategic reasons or to secure access to resources, but they're dressing it up as a humanitarian mission?
That's certainly a possibility. And it's harder to criticize an action when it's framed as purely altruistic, right? If a country presents itself as a selfless savior, it can deflect a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, it's like putting a nice shiny label on something that might not be so nice underneath. So using the word humanitarian can be a way to silence dissent or make it harder to question the real reasons behind an intervention.
Exactly. It oversimplifies a complex reality. And let's not forget, we're talking about military intervention here, which inherently involves force, violence, and sadly, unintended casualties.
It's not a bloodless affair, that's for sure.
It's not. And critics argue that the term humanitarian intervention can gloss over this reality, that it sanitizes what is ultimately an act of war.
It's like using a soft term to describe something that's inherently hard and messy.
That's a good way to put it. Some people prefer terms like humanitarian military intervention, or even just military intervention to make it clear that we're dealing with armed conflict, not some kind of peacekeeping operation.
It's about being honest about what's really going on, not sugarcoating it with feel-good language.
Exactly. And then there's another critique of the term that goes even deeper. It has to do with power dynamics.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about the power dynamics at play here.
Well, think about the typical scenario for humanitarian intervention. It often involves a powerful, developed nation intervening in a less developed country that's experiencing a crisis. And critics point out that this reinforces a kind of savior complex.
Oh, I see. It plays into this narrative of the West to the rescue. The intervening country gets to be the hero, the benevolent actor coming in to save the day, while the country being intervened in is cast as the helpless victim, unable to solve its own problems.
Exactly. And that can have some pretty damaging long-term consequences. It can perpetuate existing power imbalances and can even be seen as a new form of colonialism where powerful countries exert control over weaker ones under the guise of humanitarian concern.
It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, using the language of humanitarianism to justify actions that might actually be about maintaining global power structures.
That's a sharp observation. It's a critique that we need to take seriously when we're talking about humanitarian intervention.
Wow, we've really gone deep here. From just war theory to the complexities of R2P and now this whole unpacking of the language itself, it's clear that humanitarian intervention is anything but simple.
It's definitely not. And as we've seen, there are strong arguments to be made on all sides of this debate. It's not about finding easy answers. It's about understanding the nuances, the ethical dilemmas at the heart of this issue.
It's about recognizing that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and that even the most well-meaning interventions can have unintended consequences.
Precisely. And that's why this topic is so important for our UPSC aspirants to really grapple with, because it's not just about memorizing definitions or reciting facts.
It's about demonstrating that you can think critically about these issues, that you can see the complexities, and that you can articulate your own informed opinions.
Exactly. And that kind of analytical thinking, that ability to see multiple perspectives and weigh competing arguments, that's what's going to set you apart in the exam hall.
This has been incredible. So much food for thought already. But we're not done yet, folks. Stay tuned because we'll be right back to continue our exploration of this fascinating and vitally important topic.
Now that we've, kind of untangled some of the thornier aspects of humanitarian intervention, let's maybe zoom out a bit.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Big picture thinking. Why does all of this matter?
Exactly. Why should our listeners care? And especially for those gearing up for those UPSC exams, what are the key takeaways? What's the stuff that really matters for understanding not just the theory, but the real world implications of all this?
Right, because this isn't just some abstract academic debate.
It's not. It goes straight to the heart of some of the biggest challenges facing the international community today. How do we reconcile a country's right to govern itself with the need to protect people from harm? Where do we draw the line between staying out of other countries' business and stepping in to stop atrocities? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They play out in real conflicts, real crises every single day.
Yeah, and as we've been discussing, there's no easy answer. It's not like there's some magic formula you can apply to every situation. It's messy, it's political, and it often involves making tough choices with very limited information.
You're absolutely right. And that's why understanding the historical context is so important. I mean, the idea of humanitarian intervention, it's evolved over time. Think about the period after World War II, the creation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of that laid the groundwork for how we view human rights and the responsibility to protect them today.
Right. It's like a whole new era of international cooperation, at least in theory. But then you have specific events like the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, which was just horrific, and it really forced the world to confront the consequences of inaction, of not intervening when faced with mass atrocities. And it seems like each of these crises, each intervention, adds another layer to this ongoing debate, another piece to the puzzle.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important, especially for those preparing for the UPSC exams, to go beyond memorizing facts and dates. You need to wrestle with the complexities, to understand the nuances, the arguments for and against intervention in different contexts.
So it's about showing the examiners that you can think critically, that you can apply this knowledge to real-world situations. You can be asked to analyze the pros and cons of the RDOP framework, or to compare different historical interventions, or even to present your own well-reasoned arguments about the future of humanitarian intervention in a globalized world.
That's exactly right. It's about demonstrating that you understand the stakes, the moral and political dilemmas involved. And honestly, it's not just about acing an exam. This is about equipping yourselves with the knowledge and skills to understand the world around you, to analyze the actions of governments, to engage in informed discussions about these complex issues. This is stuff that matters.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to really chew on, something that builds on what we've talked about but takes it a step further.
I like where you're going with this. What are you thinking?
Well, we've discussed the challenges of state sovereignty, the complexities of R2P, the ethical dilemmas of intervention, but what about the future? How do you see this whole concept of humanitarian intervention evolving in the 21st century? What new challenges and opportunities might emerge?
That's a great question. And it's tough to predict with any certainty. But here are a few things that I think are worth thinking about. Technology is changing everything, right? Including warfare. We're seeing the rise of cyber warfare, the use of drones, artificial intelligence in the military. This raises a whole set of new questions about what even constitutes intervention. Is a cyber attack an act of war? What about drone strikes in another country? The lines are getting blurrier, which makes defining when intervention is justified even more complicated.
Yeah, it's not just about boots on the ground anymore. The tools of warfare are changing, which means the rules of engagement might need to change as well.
Exactly. And then there's the shifting landscape of global power. We're seeing the rise of new global players. Will this lead to a more multipolar system of intervention where regional powers have a greater say? Or will the traditional Western powers continue to dominate the narrative? These are open questions.
And of course, we can't forget about climate change. The increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters is going to lead to more humanitarian crises, more displacement, more suffering. This will put even more pressure on the international community to respond effectively, but also to think about how to prevent these crises in the first place.
You're absolutely right. We might even see entirely new categories of intervention emerging, focusing on things like climate-related displacement or resource scarcity or environmental conflict, things we haven't even thought about yet.
Wow, it feels like we're entering uncharted territory.
We are in many ways. The old rules might not apply anymore, and that's why we need to be thinking critically and creatively to develop new frameworks, new approaches that can address the challenges of the 21st century. And for our UPSC listeners, that's exactly the kind of forward thinking that will make your answers stand out.
It's about showing the examiners that you're not just regurgitating information, but that you're applying your knowledge to real-world situations, to thinking about potential solutions, to anticipating future challenges.
Exactly. Who knows, maybe one of you listening right now will be the one to come up with a groundbreaking new approach to humanitarian intervention. Maybe you'll be the one to write the next chapter in this evolving story.
That's an inspiring thought. But don't go anywhere, because we've got more to cover. We'll be right back to wrap up our discussion on this absolutely crucial and constantly evolving topic. And we're back, folks, ready to wrap up this deep dive into humanitarian intervention. Phew, this has been a journey, hasn't it?
It has. A real roller coaster of a topic. From its historical roots to the legal frameworks, the ethical dilemmas, and even how the very language we use shapes the conversation. A lot to unpack, but absolutely essential stuff, especially for those prepping for the UPSC.
Yeah, anyone who wants to understand how the world works needs to grapple with this stuff.
Yeah.
Because this isn't some dusty old theory in a textbook.
Oh, no, no, no. These concepts play out on the world stage all the time, real conflicts with real consequences.
Absolutely. So as we close this out, I want to reiterate that this concept of humanitarian intervention, it's not static, it's always evolving.
Right. It's shaped by new challenges, by technology, by the shifting balance of global power. It's dynamic. So stay curious, stay informed, and be ready to adapt your understanding as the world changes.
So important. You can't just check this box and move on. This is a topic that demands ongoing engagement and critical thinking.
Couldn't agree more. And as you continue learning, don't shy away from questioning assumptions, pushing back against dominant narratives, considering alternative viewpoints. That's what the UPSC examiners are looking for, not rote memorization. They want to see you wrestle with these issues, think deeply.
Show them you can go beyond the surface, really engage with the material, and offer thoughtful analysis. And remember, this isn't just about acing an exam, right? It's about developing the skills and knowledge you need to navigate this complex world where these issues are constantly at play.
Well said. And building on that, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, a bit of a challenge. We talked about how powerful the language surrounding humanitarian intervention is.
Oh yeah, how it shapes our understanding of these events and can even be used to justify actions that might be, well, less than humanitarian.
Exactly. So as you keep learning about this topic, pay close attention to the language being used. Who's using the term humanitarian intervention? What are their motivations? Are there other ways to frame the issue that might lead to different solutions?
Powerful point. Words carry weight, especially when we're talking about war, peace, and human suffering. By really examining the language being used, we can start to understand the power dynamics at play, maybe even shift the conversation around humanitarian intervention in a more productive direction.
Exactly. And that, my friends, is the power of knowledge, the power of critical thinking, and of taking deep dives like this into complex global issues.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Hope you found it informative, engaging, and maybe even sparked some new ideas.
As always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. And for our UPSC folks out there, best of luck on your exams.
And for everyone listening, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into these crucial global issues. Until next time, keep learning.